Welcome to this supplemental lecture that will go into some greater detail about the principles of phonology than we'll have time to do during class. Please note that this lecture was prepared by Jeff Kahn, who used it in teaching his Introduction to Linguistics course a few years ago. He's graciously given permission for me to share it with you and to add this voiceover. However, the voiceover is written by and recorded by me, so any mistakes I make in the voiceover should be considered mine and mine alone. Let's dive right in. Jeff begins with a really nice review of the taxonomic classification of consonants using voicing, place, manner terminology. Most of this will be fairly familiar to you at this point, and I'll only point out that Jeff has arranged things in a fairly conventional and principled way. The three tables each contain certain types of sounds. One has all the stops, another has all the fricatives and affricates, and the third has all of the sonorant sounds. We haven't really encountered this word yet, but it's the term that captures all nasals, liquids, and glides. Within each table, you'll notice that the sounds are arranged by manner, and then within each manner, the sounds are always listed from the most front place of articulation to the most back place of articulation. So in the stops, you have all the labial stops first, followed by the alveolar stops, then the velar stops, and lastly the glottal stop. And then within each place of articulation, a voiceless sound will always be written before the corresponding voiced sound. So p comes before b, t comes before d, and so forth. This principle also applies to the fricatives, where the labiodental fricatives come first with voiceless before voiced, then the interdental fricatives, alveolar fricatives, and so forth. The sonorants are the same way, but there are no voiceless sonorants. That's part of what makes them sonorant, in fact. So they're all organized by manner first, then by place, from front to back. One sound I'll call your attention to is It's given here as a voiced alveolar retroflex liquid. This is a fine designation for this consonant, but you'll see significant variation in how people classify this sound, especially in terms of place. Here, Jeff has called it alveolar. This is consistent with what Lattifoged says, and it's what's given on the official IPA chart. You might notice that in my consonant chart, I've listed this sound as palatal. There's even a good rationale for considering it to be velar. These variances are due to the articulatory complexity of the sound, which often includes two different distinct places of constriction, together with the well-documented person-to-person variability in production. There are really two ways of producing One is usually called retroflex, and it's produced with the tip of the tongue pointing slightly backwards in the mouth, creating a primary obstruction right near the end of the alveolar ridge. Thus, this sound can be considered alveolar. Another production type is called bunched. In this production, the tip of the tongue is down near the front of the mouth, and the center or back of the tongue is raised, creating a primary obstruction at the hard palate or at the velum. Therefore, it could be considered to be palatal or velar. All of this complexity is not nearly as important, though, as the fact that it's a liquid, and in particular that it's a rhotic liquid. For all practical purposes, these terminological questions are fairly unimportant. You can completely specify that you're talking about just by saying that you mean the rhotic sound or the retroflex sound. The only one of these is You should be accustomed, however, to the fact that you'll see people write about or refer to with traditional voicing, place, and manner terms, and there tends to be substantial variability in the place designation for this sound. Here's a nice version of the consonant chart that you saw in our class notes. There are only a few small differences between Jeff's chart and mine. One is that I included the tap, and Jeff omitted it. This is fine. Remember that the tap is not a distinctive sound in English, so it can often be left off of charts like this. In addition, you'll see that Jeff has both and as alveolar liquids. Ordinarily, when you have two sounds in a single cell in a consonant chart, you would put the voiceless one to the left and the voiced one to the right. But for these two liquids, both of them are voiced. There are no voiceless liquids listed. This is why Jeff has placed ul above rather than placing them side by side. In addition, this allows him to indicate the distinction between lateral and retroflex liquids. Finally, you'll see that Jeff has included w as both a labial glide and as a velar glide. Ladefoged addresses this by noting that w is really dual articulated, meaning that there are two essential movement patterns necessary to produce this sound. One involves a constriction at the lips, and the other involves a constriction further back in the mouth at the velum. Finally, Jeff has included a second labiovelar glide, indicated by this upside-down W-looking character. Though we haven't discussed this symbol in class yet, can you guess what it's supposed to be, simply from the fact that it occurs in the same cell with a voiced labiovelar glide, but to the left of that sound? You guessed it, it's a voiceless labiovelar glide. This is a sound that isn't used much anymore, but fans of older movies will be able to hear it in abundance. It's the sound at the beginning of which, or why, as produced by movie actors of earlier eras. This sound has largely died out in modern American speech patterns, so that now most people tend to say which and why with voiced labiovelar glides. This kind of sound change is common enough in the evolution of languages. What makes this one a little bit different is that it's played itself out during the age of recordings, so we can all hear lots of very clear examples of how the language used to work. One last note on Jeff's asterisk, in which he says that it's okay to use the right side up or the right side up r for the voiced alveolar retroflex liquid. This is a convention that's been changing slowly in recent years. It used to be that everyone used right side up R for this sound. That's the way I was trained many decades ago. But the IPA has changed, and Ladefoged discusses this briefly. The basic story is that the use of right side up R for the English sound is very Anglo-centric. The English sound is actually quite an oddity. Very few languages use our rhotic sound for their R-like sound. Anyone who's studied Spanish knows that the Spanish R is a trill, and that it sounds very different from the English rhotic sound. In fact, Spanish is much more consistent with most of the world's languages, and in recognition of this fact, the IPA decided several years ago that the normal-looking R character, that is, the right side up R, should be used for the sound that's more prominent in the world's languages. That's the trill. And then they decided that the rare and exotic sound, that is, the English rhotic should have a character that's both unusual and exotic looking, and that's the upside down R. Now, change is hard, and many prominent phoneticians didn't take to this change fully. In fact, Peter Ladefoged himself continued to use the right side up R in every edition of this textbook, all the way through the 6th edition. He was able to do this partly because his name was Peter Ladefoged, and I would suggest that if your name is Peter Ladefoged, then you can do this as well. But if your name is something other than Peter Ladefoged, I'll say that you should use the currently accepted IPA convention and transcribe the English rhotic sound using only the upside-down R character. Just a full disclaimer, Ladefoged actually had a genuine theoretically sound justification for continuing to use the right side up R in transcribing English, and that is that there's no contrast in English between the rhotic sound and the trill sound. Linguistic phonology is largely based on the principle of identifying meaningful contrasts, and in situations where there is no meaningful contrast, it's very common and quite acceptable to ignore certain details in the interests of convenience and brevity. This is really what Ladefoged likely would have said. It wasn't really that he just couldn't handle the change, but that English has no contrast that's relevant to these sounds, so it's perfectly acceptable to use a shorthand notation in that situation. He wasn't wrong, but I'm going to stick to the principle that you're not allowed to do it, unless your name is Peter Ladefoged. Here's Jeff's version of the vowel chart. You'll notice that many things are very similar to how I've given you my preferred vowel chart, and that there are a few glaring differences. The biggest is in the transcription of diphthongs. Where we use a lax vowel as the second member of all diphthongs, Jeff uses glides. Yeah, I know this seems odd, using consonants to transcribe things that are clearly vowels. But remember that glides are also called semivowels. And one reason for this is that they really do act very much like vowels in certain ways. The transcription convention Jeff is using here is one with a very strong tradition in the field of linguistics. It's certainly an older convention, but you'll still find it very much in use by linguists. The field of speech-language pathology has not really adopted this convention. And it's pretty universal to see diphthongs transcribed with lax vowels instead of glides. So where Jeff has written AJ, we would write A little capital I. And where he writes AW, we would write A horseshoe. They really do mean the same thing, and they're a great example of people using different conventions to convey the same information. In our class, we'll stick to the conventions we've discussed in class, and we will not use glides to transcribe diphthongs. One last very nice thing Jeff has done on this chart is add in the two additional dimensions of rounding and tenseness. He does this by using a dotted lined box around all the rounded vowels. Note that they're all back vowels, and nearly all of the back vowels are rounded. All other vowels are unrounded. The tense vowels are circled, and you'll see that they're distributed throughout the vowel chart. Where tenseness mostly comes into play is when you have two vowels in the same quadrant of the vowel space. For example, there are two vowels in the high front area, E and I. To fully specify which vowel you mean when you're referring to a high front vowel, you need to add one additional dimension. That dimension is tenseness. You'll see that throughout the chart, wherever there are two vowels in one quadrant, one of them is tense, the other is lax. These are often referred to as tense-lax pairs. As I mentioned in class the other day, this concept was originally thought to indicate that one vowel was produced with more muscular tension than the other. That idea has not held up well to scrutiny, and the current thinking is that tenseness is likely something else. What's very interesting, as we'll see later on in this course, is that tense vowels and lax vowels do some systematically different things. In other words, they pattern together with each other in certain ways that are quite unexpected and don't seem to have anything to do with muscular tension. They do seem to be fundamentally different, though, and it's intriguing that throughout the vowel space, the tense-lax pairs seem to regularly occur within the same quadrant of vowel space. We're going to skip this slide since it was really for his linguistics class, and the chapters don't even correspond to our textbook. But see if you can read Jeff's transcription at the top. Notice that his accent atop the ah vowel means that this is the stress syllable, and remember that he uses glide symbols to represent the second members of diphthongs. Okay, here's where we start to talk about phonology. This is a daunting concept for many people because it takes speech sounds, which you can hear and feel, and looks at them as abstract units that are not supposed to be heard and felt. This is the point. Phonological representations occur in the brain as a part of the conceptual organization of the language system. We're going to use some symbols that look just like phonetic symbols for representing these phonological concepts, but keep in mind that phonological units are abstract. Broadly speaking, Phonology is the study of sound patterns and systematic phonetic variation found in a human language. Jeff has added a few vocabulary terms here, including the idea of segments, which are individual speech sounds, also called phones, features, which refer to things that make some sounds similar to or different from other sounds, and syllables, which are macro units typically composed of more than one sound in a linear order. A core idea in the study of phonology is the search for meaningful contrast between sounds. What this means is that one of the first goals of phonology is to figure out which sound differences can result in changes in meaning between words. To do this, the first thing we look for are minimal pairs. A minimal pair is a pair of words that have all of their speech sounds identical except one. Since there's only one speech sound that's different, and the two words mean different things, then we can conclude that the difference between those two speech sounds is what is signaling that difference in meaning. This is what we mean by looking for meaningful contrast between sounds. We've already talked about a few examples of minimal pairs, and it's a good exercise to try to find additional examples of minimal pairs. We can start with something like sip and zip. These words differ only in their first sound, where one has s, the other has z. All the other sounds are identical. This tells us that s and z are two sounds that are used in English to signal a difference in meaning. There are many other minimal pairs that also prove this difference, bus and buzz, sap and zap, etc., but really only one minimal pair is necessary to prove that two sounds are used contrastively in a language. The study of phonology often begins with the search for minimal pairs, which is the basis for identifying the entire set of contrastive sounds that are used in any language. We'll revisit the concept of the environment of a sound, but for now you can think of it as the sounds that are just before or just after the sound that you're examining. Jeff brings up near minimal pairs, and these are sometimes very useful in fine-tuned phonological analyses. You won't have to deal with near minimal pairs in this course, but it might be useful to know that there aren't really any true minimal pairs that prove that the two interdental fricatives, th and th, are really different sounds in English. There are, however, lots of near minimal pairs, such as author and either, in which you see these sounds occurring in extremely similar environments. Remember, environment means the sounds on either side of the sound in question. For a variety of reasons, which we won't go into here, it can be okay to use near minimal pairs along with other pieces of evidence to demonstrate meaningful differences among sounds. But you won't have to do that for this course. Let's do some practice identifying minimal pairs. Here's a set of words along with their transcriptions. The superscript H in team, for example, means that the sound is aspirated. More on that later and in Lattifoged. What are the minimal pairs in this list, and which sounds do they demonstrate as having meaningful differences in English? You might want to pause the video for a minute to work on this. Okay, so here's my answer. Blue and glue are a minimal pair, establishing that b and g are used to contrast meaning. Similarly, hook and hood do the same thing for d and k. And team and tomb show that e and oo are different. Finally, the words cot and caught are interesting. In these transcriptions, you can see that the ah sound is different from the open O sound. This shows that these two sounds are different, and they are in my dialect. But many speakers, especially those who grew up on the West Coast and don't use the open O vowel, for them, the words cot and caught sound the same. They both have the vowel ah, cot and caught. These speakers lack this particular vowel contrast, And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with not having this contrast, and in fact it's likely a growing trend. In 50 to 100 years, there might well be no more open O sound in the vast majority of American dialects. Boston, however, might well persist with its open O for much longer. One final note here. Notice that bat and pack are not a minimal pair. There are two differences in these words, so it isn't possible to tell which difference is signaling the difference in meaning with these two words. Be sure to check that a pair of words really has only one difference if you're thinking of it as a minimal pair. Here's some more practice. For each of these different sounds, find a minimal pair in English. You might want to pause the video while you write your answers. Okay, now I'll put up an example for each of these pairs. Notice that it doesn't matter where in the word the sound contrast happens. It could be at the beginning of the word, in the middle of the word, or at the end. As long as the sounds occur in the same place in both words of the minimal pair, it's good. So why all this buzz about minimal pairs? I mean, sure, it's true that tip and sip mean different things, and that they're a minimal pair, but so what? Isn't that kind of trivial? Well, it only seems trivial when you're looking at English, which is a language that you know very well. The big importance of minimal pairs is that this is the primary way in which we determine what the phonemes of a language are. Phonemes are segments that contrast with each other in a particular language to create meaning differences. So it's true that in English, tip and sip prove that t and s are different phonemes, and this won't surprise anyone in this class. What's interesting is that this is not true in all languages. There are languages in which there are no minimal pairs in which t and s create a meaningful contrast, and yet they might well produce both t and s in that language. How can that be? Well, it might be that the two sounds are actually deeply related to each other in that language. They might actually belong to the same phoneme. We'll go through some examples of things like that in a bit. First, though, it's worth noting that in English, you won't be able to find minimal pairs for some sounds, say at the beginnings of words, or other sounds at the ends of words, mostly because these sounds might not occur in those places. For example, there are no words in English that begin with the velar nasal ng, nor are there any words that begin with the voiced postalveolar fricative zh. And the voiceless glottal fricative h does not occur at the end of any English words. Why? No reason, they just don't. This may be a somewhat unsatisfying answer, but sometimes it's the only one possible. It's tempting to think that there must be something harder about starting a word with ng or zh, but there are tons of languages out there that do just that, and speakers of those languages never have any difficulty doing it. It isn't harder for them, even though it seems weird to us to think about doing it. It seems foreign. And in fact, it is foreign for native English speakers. But foreign is not the same as objectively more difficult, and this is an important concept to bear in mind. This chart is basically the same as all of the other consonant charts you've seen, though with a couple of differences in the details. First, the manner categories have been collapsed into non-continuants, which are sounds that involve at least some full stoppage of air, and continuants, which have continuous airflow throughout their production. The last two categories, nasals and liquids/glides, are also continuants, but they're separated out because they belong to another group of sounds known as sonorants. This chart also provides an example word for each sound, creating minimal pair examples to show how specific sounds can be demonstrated to be separate phonemes in English. There are two sounds missing from this chart compared with the chart that I used in class, the glottal stop and the tap or flap. Jeff asks why these sounds are not on the chart. It's a good question, and the answer is that this chart is supposed to show only those sounds that are separate phonemes in English. there are no examples of minimal pairs that involve the glottal stop or the tap in English. Therefore, these sounds are not separate phonemes in English. We make these sounds regularly and consistently, but only in those situations where some kind of phonological rule tells us to change some other phoneme into a glottal stop or a tap. We'll see some examples of this later. So, we've talked a fair amount about minimal pairs and about how they're the standard way to demonstrate what the phonemes of a language are. But what's the alternative? In other words, what if there are no minimal pairs for two different sounds? Well, here's an example of two different sounds that we make in English, specifically the voiced alveolar lateral liquid ul and the voiceless alveolar lateral liquid. As mentioned in Lattifoged, it's typical that when ul comes after most sounds like b, g, or s, or any of these other sounds, it's produced as expected, as a voiced sound. But when ul comes right after a voiceless stop, such as p, t, or k, something else happens. The ul is voiceless. You can demonstrate this by slowing down the production of a word like plow. Notice that we could change it to have a voiced ul sound, plow, and that it sounds a little bit funny. Not like a whole different word necessarily, but a bit affected. This is characteristic of two sounds that are phonetically very different sounds, in this case voiced and voiceless liquids, but which belong to the same phonemic category. In other words, these two different sounds are not used to contrast meaning in our language. When this happens, when there are two different sounds that are produced, but the two sounds are not used to contrast meaning, then we want to learn something else about them. Specifically, we want to know when to produce one sound and when to produce the other sound. It might seem like these changes might be random. But what's interesting about language is that these things usually aren't random. Usually we can figure out exactly how to predict which sound will occur in which word. The task is to figure out how to make this prediction. It's a kind of a puzzle, one in which we're searching for a regular pattern that we can identify. In the case of ul, the pattern is fairly easy. Every time the sound comes after a voiceless stop, the ul is voiceless. Anytime ul shows up anywhere else, it's voiced. So given any word in English, we can predict which variant of the lateral liquid will be produced, even if we're talking about a nonsense word. So if we gave an English speaker this word to pronounce, we would predict that the speaker would produce a voiceless lateral liquid. It doesn't matter if the speaker has any training in phonetics or if the speaker has said the particular word before. In fact, in this example, since it's a nonsense word, we can be reasonably certain that they haven't said it before. English speakers will do this reliably. It's a part of the knowledge that English speakers have about their language. It's phonological knowledge. Please note that this knowledge is not usually conscious. Most speakers don't even think that they are producing two different sounds. But you can clearly demonstrate that the voiced lateral liquid is a different sound from the voiceless lateral liquid, and you can prove that English speakers produce both of these sounds. But they think of these two sounds as the same. That's because these two sounds belong to the same phoneme. These two sounds are deeply related to each other in English. They are not used to contrast meaning, and in fact, it's very easy to predict when one sound will be produced and when the other sound will be produced. When sounds are not used to contrast meaning in a language, we say that those sounds, in this case the voiced and voiceless lateral liquids, are allophones of the same underlying phoneme. Let's take a look at another well-known example in English. We've talked about how voiceless stops, like p, are aspirated when they occur right at the beginning of a syllable, like in pit. And we've talked about how when that same sound occurs after s, like in spit, the bilabial stop is produced without aspiration. And lastly, we've seen how when p occurs before another stop sound, like an apt, the p will be unreleased. These three variants of p, unaspirated, aspirated, and unreleased, are all allophones of the same underlying phoneme. And this chart takes us one step further, showing that not only do we know where each variant will be produced, but also that the other two variants are never produced in that same environment. That's what this asterisk means in linguistics. Something after an asterisk is not allowed. It doesn't mean that it's impossible, just that it's never observed in the natural productions of the speakers of a language. It violates some kind of a rule, and it would automatically be considered weird or incorrect by native speakers. As an example, I'll produce spit with aspiration. Spit. I can do it, but it sounds really off. The fact that these sounds occur consistently and exclusively in their respective environments is a characteristic we call complementary distribution. This means that where you see one variant of a sound, you will never see another variant of that sound. It's very common to find allophones, or variants of a phoneme, that occur in complementary distribution. An analogy might help here. Think of these three sound variants. They're in complementary distribution because where you see one of them, you'll never see another one of them. This is a little bit like the idea of Superman and Clark Kent. No one ever sees these two characters in the same place at the same time, so you could think of unaspirated voiceless stop as Clark Kent and the aspirated voiceless stop as Superman. Where you see Clark Kent, you will never see Superman, and where you see Superman, you'll never see Clark Kent. Now we know at one level that Superman and Clark Kent are really the same person, right? But they do look, sound, and act differently despite their underlying sameness. It's the same thing with these sounds. They're the same at one level, though at another level we can clearly identify significant differences. And of course, in this example we have a third character, the unreleased voiceless stop, so we'll have to imagine a third persona that this person can take on. This third person is the same person as Superman and Clark Kent, but looks, sounds, and acts different from either Superman or Clark Kent. And just like our sound variants, it would be nice if we could identify the environments in which we would expect to see any one of these three personas. Well, we can. In particular, if we happen to be at the Daily Planet, then we're going to see Clark Kent, but not Superman. And if we're observing someone saving the world, then we'll be seeing Superman and not Clark Kent. And if we're unwinding at Darcel's after a hard day's work, then we won't be seeing either Clark Kent or Superman, but we will see this person, who doesn't really have a name since it's sort of imaginary. And just for anyone who's wondering, it's not an actual picture of Christopher Reeve in drag. In other words, the three personas that we think of as Superman each have their specific environments within which they're going to be seen. You can think of it as a hierarchy. There is this thing that's called Superman. Sometimes this thing shows itself as Clark Kent, sometimes it shows itself in drag, and sometimes it shows itself in a cape and a costume with a big red S on it. All three of them are the same being, and we can describe the environments within which we would expect to see each of these three realizations of Superman. Well, it's the same thing with sounds. We think of a phoneme as being the thing on the top of the tree. It's what exists in your brain as a representation of a sound. In this example, we have a phoneme represented by this character. When we discuss phonemic representations, we put them between slashes to indicate that we're talking about phonemes. Now, this phoneme has three different personas that we've identified. One of them is aspirated, one of them is unaspirated, and one is unreleased. Every time you see a voiceless bilabial stop, you'll see it in some kind of phonetic context. And this context will tell you exactly which of the types of voiceless bilabial stop will occur. So if it comes after s, then you'll see the unaspirated variant. If it comes right before another stop, you'll see the unreleased variant. And if it comes at the very beginning of a syllable, then you'll see the aspirated version. Another analogy that can be used is that of a filing cabinet drawer. The drawer itself is the phonology of the entire language. And within that drawer, you have a green hanging folder for each phoneme in the language. Then, within each green hanging folder, you have some manila folders that hold the actual sounds that your mouth produces. So inside your green hanging folder for p, you would have 3 manila folders, one of them for the aspirated variant, one for the unaspirated variant, and one for the unreleased variant. And to get a sound that you actually produce, you always have to first open up the drawer, in other words, access your phonological system, then find the right green hanging folder, in other words, know that you'll have some kind of voiceless bilabial stop, and then figure out which manila folder to open up. How do you know which manila folder to open? You look at the sounds around the voiceless bilabial stop, and that environment tells you which one to open. Just like if you know whether you're at the Daily Planet or at Darcell's, you'll know which Superman variant you'll see. This is complementary distribution, because the environments within which the sound variants are distributed complement each other. They don't overlap. And because they don't overlap, you can identify the characteristics of each environment based on the phonetic categories we've described. We'll go through a couple of examples of this soon. But first, one very important concept. How phonemes relate to allophonic variants is specific to each language. So we've talked about the voiceless bilabial stop phoneme in English and how there are 3 variants. Here you see 2 of them represented. The unreleased variant is omitted here because it isn't relevant in this example. In English, you can see that the unaspirated p and aspirated p are part of the same phoneme. So there will be no minimal pairs in English based on this characteristic. However, in Thai, that's not the case. There are numerous minimal pairs in Thai in which the only difference is that one has an aspirated p and the other has an unaspirated p. So, pa and pa mean different things in Thai. This is evidence that the Thai phonological system has 2 different phonemes, one of which is an aspirated voiceless bilabial stop, and the other of which is an unaspirated voiceless bilabial stop. This is a great example of the difference between phonetic and phonemic representations. In both Thai and English, we produce both of these sounds. But in English, we think of them as the same sound, while in Thai they think of them as different sounds. This can create some difficulties when a speaker of Thai, for example, starts to learn English. Our sound categories are different from the ones that they know, and as a result, a speaker of Thai might encounter some problems. Returning to the Superman analogy, we could say that this speaker of Thai, who's trying to learn English pronunciation, might be a bit like a resident of Metropolis, perhaps even Lois Lane herself. Lois sees Clark Kent and Superman and observes that they look, act, and sound different. Because of this, she believes that there are 2 different people. Native speakers of English, like viewers of the Superman movie or readers of a Superman comic book, have access to different information than Lois Lane does. We know that Superman and Clark Kent are the same, despite their surface-level differences. So when we see Clark Kent at the Daily Planet, we can't help but think, oh, that's Superman. No one else knows it, but I do. The only difference between that knowledge and our linguistic knowledge is that our knowledge about Superman is explicit. We are told in the story that they're the same person. And our enjoyment of the narrative is based in part on the fact that we, as viewers, know something different from what most of the other characters know. In language, our knowledge is implicit. No one tells us about the underlying consistencies, and there are no major motion pictures that rely on the fact that native speakers of a language know something that non-native speakers don't know. And it works both ways, too. So when a native speaker of English starts to learn Thai, They'll very likely have a hard time telling the difference between certain words in Thai. We will be likely to misunderstand what's said to us and to pronounce things in a way that will make the native Thai speakers notice that we have a distinct foreign accent. This is in part because we'll look at certain different sounds and think of them as the same. I can't think of a snazzy movie analogy in which the main character looks around him and thinks that everyone is the same, but we know that everyone is in fact different. But you could perhaps imagine such a narrative. It even sounds like good fodder for a Twilight Zone episode. But the point is that native speakers of any language have an intimate but implicit knowledge of their own speech sound system's patterns. And they're quite likely to apply that knowledge to any new language that they start to learn. So let's return to some examples from English and go through the search for environments for different sounds. Coming back to the lateral liquid example, you'll remember that lateral liquids, which we usually think of as voiced, become voiceless when they come after voiceless stops. The same thing is true of all liquids and glides, so we can look at them all together. Remember that liquids and glides together are called approximants. Now we have a very nice, concise, and easy to conceptualize environment where we'll expect to see a voiceless approximant appear. How about the voiced approximants? Where do they appear? Well, they appear after voiced stops, they appear after nasals, and they appear after voiceless fricatives, and they even appear when they're the very first sound in a word. Now, this is not a nice, concise, easy to conceptualize environment. In fact, it seems to be several environments. And when you look at these environments, the only thing left over is exactly the environment that we just said would be where a voiceless approximant would occur. So it's almost like if a sound is not in the voiceless approximant environment, then it will be a voiced approximant. A voiced approximant is what you will find anywhere else besides that specific environment where the voiceless approximant would occur. So we could say that you'll get a voiceless approximant after a voiceless stop, and you'll get a voiced approximant elsewhere. This is called the elsewhere condition, and it's very common that when you look at the environments where different allophones occur, you'll find some environments that are easy to identify, such as after voiceless stops, and you'll often find one environment that is very hard to identify, such as after voiceless fricatives, after voice stops, after nasals, and when word initial. Such a complex environment is usually the elsewhere condition. Once you've described any and all easy-to-describe environments and found an elsewhere condition, the job of determining allophonic distribution should be done. You should be able to predict, in any word, which allophone you should expect. In this case, it all boils down to two environments. Approximants have voiceless allophones after voiceless stops, and voiced allophones elsewhere. What could be simpler, right? Now let's get into a more complex example. Here we see the three allophones of p, with a set of words showing where each allophone occurs. Then we have a chart showing some different possible environments where allophones might occur. Below are some definitions of this linguistic notation. The underline shows where the sound of interest, in this case some kind of a p, occurs, and what's around that underline shows the environment. A pound sign, these days better known as a hashtag, means word boundary. So hashtag underline means that there's a word boundary and then the sound of interest. This means that p is occurring as the very first sound in the word. Conversely, underline hashtag means that the sound of interest occurs right before a word boundary. So this would be p occurring at the very end of a word. Where you see a capital C, this means any consonant. And where you see a capital V, that means any vowel. Where you see nothing specified, such as right here, it means that it doesn't matter what comes next. It could be anything. When we look at the environments and which allophone of p shows up in each environment, we see that there is no overlap. This is characteristic of complementary distribution. Check to see that you can identify each of these three allophones in the environments given. Complementary distribution is a particularly common pattern in the study of phonology. In fact, it's quite common in phonology courses to get problem sets in which you're given a set of words and a set of sounds to concentrate on. You're then asked whether these sounds are different phonemes or allophones of the same phoneme, and if they're allophones, to describe the environments within which to expect each allophone. Such problem sets have a very similar process to go through in order to solve them. The first step is to check for minimal pairs. If you find that the sounds that you're examining are used to form minimal pairs, then you have conclusive evidence that the sounds are used as different phonemes. Your task is done. Now this seems fairly easy, and in fact it is. With a little practice, anyone can become quite skilled at finding minimal pairs. And because that task is so easy, only the first few problem sets that students see involve actual minimal pairs. Once students can identify minimal pairs, very few phonology problems will give you examples in which the sounds are actually separate phonemes. At least in the first couple of terms of phonology courses. There are some more complex examples that will show up as you get deeper into the topic. Most phonology problems, therefore, are designed to show allophonic relationships. In other words, sounds that are not used as separate phonemes in the language in question, but instead are parts of the same underlying phoneme. So the real task is to identify the environments within which each allophone occurs. This is essentially a pattern recognition task. Knowing what you know about sound categories, your job is to find out which sounds go together to form the environment that governs the appearance of the different allophones. So let's try one. For most of you, this will be your first actual phonology problem set, and it's set up to be pretty easy. The question tells you to concentrate on the sounds glottal stop and h, and asks you whether they're separate phonemes in Arabic. Now, we've talked about this question in English. Most people will call glottal stop an allophone in English, which only appears when another sound turns into a glottal stop as a result of some kind of phonological rule. But Arabic is a different language and it has its own phonology. So our task is to ignore what we know about English phonology and only deal with the data from Arabic that are presented. The task of solving a problem set is pretty consistent. The first thing to do is to see if the words contain any minimal pairs that differ only in the sound that we're supposed to be paying attention to, in this case glottal stop and h. Now looking down this column, I don't see any relevant pairs, but when I look at number 7, why it's number 7 when we don't see a 5 or a 6, I don't know, but that's irrelevant to the problem set. I see something that's exactly like number 1, but where 1 has a glottal stop, number 7 has h, and the two words have different meanings. This is a great minimal pair. In fact, this means that the problem set is solved. Finding a single minimal pair is all that's necessary to prove that these two sounds are actually different phonemes in Arabic. As it turns out, there are some other minimal pairs in the dataset, with numbers 2 and 8, 3 and 9, and 4 and 10. They all form minimal pairs. As you might expect, since this is your first problem set, the words have been laid out in a way that makes it particularly easy to solve the problem. Most problem sets will not be this easy. In fact, here's a harder one. This comes from Japanese, and the question is to look at 3 different sounds, t, ch, and ts, which is classified as a voiceless alveolar affricate and is a sound that we don't have in English. And to determine if these 3 sounds are different phonemes or allophones of the same phoneme. I'd encourage you to look through the words to see if you find any relevant minimal pairs. You won't find any. So looking back at the problem set flowchart, the first question is answered with a no minimal pairs. So the next thing to do is called organizing your data. This means to start the process of looking at the phonetic environment where each of the relevant sounds occurs. This is a fairly painstaking, detail-oriented process because you really don't know what you're looking for, so you have to be rigorous in including all of the relevant information. Here are some of the phonetic environments we've looked at before. Word initially, we have examples of all three sounds. Word finally, we don't have any examples of any of the three sounds. After s, we also see no examples of the relevant sounds. In fact, we don't really see any examples of s occurring on its own in this data set. This is a good example of how you can fall into the trap of looking for sound environments that you've seen before, but which might not be relevant to the problem or even to the language you're working on. So instead, you have to start more or less from scratch. Make a chart with your three sounds on it. Then go word by word through the data and list the environment as completely as you can. So in the first word, tayo, the relevant sound is t, and it occurs right after a word boundary and right before the sound ah. The next word is tatami. This word has two relevant examples of t. The first relevant example is just like the t in the first word. It's word initial and immediately before ah. But the second t has a new environment. In this case, it occurs immediately after ah and immediately before ah. Even though both of these environments share one element, they're both immediately before ah, it's worthwhile at this stage to write both of the environments down separately. Remember, we have no idea what will turn out to be important, so we should write it all down now. Going through the rest of the words, we find that there are 8 different environments where t occurs. Doing the same thing for ch shows 3 different environments, and ts shows up in 3 different environments also. This is organized data. According to our flowchart for solving phonology problems, the next step is to check for complementary distribution. This means that we should look to see if there's something that consistently predicts the appearance of one or more of these sounds. When we look at the t environments, it's actually pretty chaotic. Not a lot of consistency jumps out. When we look at ch, something else happens. The sound after ch is always e. That seems pretty consistent. And when we look at ts, the same thing happens. Every single time ts appears, the very next sound is oo. And what about t? Well, it never shows up before e, and it never shows up before oo. When does it show up? Elsewhere. We have a complete separation of environments, and we have an elsewhere condition. This is the kind of thing that makes linguists' hearts race with excitement. According to this data set, we've discovered that in Japanese, there are 3 different sounds, t, ch, and ts, that are all part of the same phoneme. 2 of them are described by easy-to-identify environments, one before e, one before oo, and one of them occurs elsewhere. The heavy work is done, and only one more thing remains. That is to figure out which of these 3 sounds is the most basic of the sounds. In other words, which one should we call the underlying sound? What's underlying is necessarily abstract. But in linguistics, we want to represent abstract linguistic knowledge in a way that connects to the things that we see and hear. So we'll usually try to find one of the actual sound symbols to use as the underlying representation for a phoneme. Putting some jargon to these ideas, an underlying representation can be thought of as what is unpredictable. In our filing cabinet analogy, this is like the green hanging folder. When you grab the green hanging folder, you haven't opened it yet, so it's still unpredictable which manila folder you'll get from the inside. The manila folders themselves would be called the surface representation. This is what your mouth actually produces, and your mouth only knows which sound to actually produce after you have opened up the green hanging folder and taken out a manila folder. The process of opening up the green hanging folder and knowing which manila folder to take out is governed by what we will call phonological rules. The process of figuring out a rule starts with deciding which sound to consider underlying. In most cases, if you've found an elsewhere condition, then you should start with the sound that's in the elsewhere condition. Call that sound underlying, and then see if you can derive all of the other sounds by easily stated rules. Doing this with Japanese, you'll remember that the sound that had the elsewhere condition was t, so let's try working from there. If t is underlying, then at some deep phonological level in the mind of a speaker of Japanese, the word for mat is tatami. Note that the word for strawberry, which we've seen in its surface representation as ichigo, would have to be different in its underlying representation. Because this word has a non-underlying sound, we would have to replace that sound with the underlying sound t in its underlying representation. So the underlying representation of ichigo would actually be itigo. The word for chores has the sound u after our sound of interest, so where the surface representation was zatsuzi, its underlying representation would be zatuzi. We would then say that every underlying representation has to check the phonological rules of the language before being pronounced. In this case, because we know that ch only occurs before e, and that t and ts never occur before e, we can say that t becomes ch when it occurs before e. And because we know that ts occurs only before u, and that t and ch never occur before u, we could say that t becomes ts when it occurs before u. And that's it. We have two rules, and every word with a t in its underlying representation has to check itself against these rules. When it does, if the word has an e right after t, then that t will change into ch just in time to be pronounced that way. And if the word has u right after t, then the t will change into ts just in time to be pronounced that way. And if the word has something else right after the t, then we have a default situation. And in the default situation, the rule says to pronounce the default sound. So in the elsewhere condition, the phoneme t will be pronounced as the allophone t. This doesn't mean that there's no phonological rule. It simply means that a set of default specifications can be said to apply. And this is the advantage of determining an underlying sound. If you choose a sound with a wide distribution, then the default values are already specified for you. So to review, the study of phonology deals with sound patterns and discovering systematic patterns of sound variation within a language. It involves two parts. First, we want to know what sounds are different phonemes in a language. Second, we want to know how any particular phoneme might change as a result of being in a specific phonetic environment. Phonological rules are the ways in which we relate the phonemes of a language, which are abstract units that exist only in the mind of a native speaker, to the sounds that are actually produced out of the mouths of those native speakers. The standard process for solving problems in phonology is to first look for minimal pairs. These tell you what sounds are being used as different phonemes. Where minimal pairs do not exist, then you should start to wonder if in fact the different sounds you're hearing might be allophones of the same underlying phoneme. Then you should start to look for systematic ways in which those two sounds are distributed. The most common way to find that kind of systematic distribution is to look for complementary distribution. If you can find predictable environments within which certain sounds are consistently produced and other sounds are never produced, then you have a really good case for an allophonic relationship between those sounds. Now there's certainly more to phonology than this, but if you can accomplish the two-step process of finding phonemes and describing allophonic relationships at this basic level, you'll have accomplished a great deal, certainly all that's required for this course, and perhaps as much as half of a course solely dedicated to phonology. But talking about it is not the same as actually doing it. So let's do it. Here's some data from Zinakantec Tzotzil, which is a Mayan language spoken in some of the Mexican highlands. The problem asks you to consider two sets of sounds, p and a funny p, and k and a funny k. We'll see later on in this course that the diacritic with the two funny sounds means that these two sounds are ejectives. For solving this problem, though, you don't even need to know what an ejective is. You just need to know that it's different from the regular stop sound that you're familiar with. So you might wish to pause this video while you work through this problem. remember to start by looking for minimal pairs, and if you find no minimal pairs, then start to organize your data. When you start playing again, I'll take you through the solution. Okay, so this one is somewhat easy. In this case, as we look through for minimal pairs, we find some. Word 5 and word 12 differ only in the two p sounds, and words 3 and 6 differ only in the two k sounds. This is all we need, in fact. You'll also find that words 9 and 11 are another minimal pair for the k sounds, and Jeff has indicated a couple of near minimal pairs that can sometimes be used for additional support. These are more advanced, and you won't need to worry about them in this course. The true minimal pairs are enough, though, to demonstrate that in this language, the ejective stop sounds are different phonemes from the non-ejective stop sounds. Problem solved. Here's another example. Pause the video while you do your own solution, and I'll be back when you hit play again. This, too, is a fairly easy problem. You're asked to look at h and glottal stop in Tagalog, the national language of the Philippines, in case you were wondering. And again, there are minimal pairs. Words A and E and words B and F are all that are needed to show that these two sounds are separate phonemes in Tagalog. Easy, right? Well, it is easy if they give you minimal pairs. That's why after this problem set, you'll probably only rarely find sets that actually give you minimal pairs. The only reason why instructors continue to give sets with minimal pairs is to be sure that students are being honest and actually going through the step of looking for minimal pairs. You do have to do this step, and you should always be prepared to find them, but most problem sets will be designed with a different goal in mind. Here's a set from a language that they didn't even name. It doesn't matter. You don't have to know anything about the language, where it comes from, what it's related to, or anything else in order to solve a phonology problem set. Everything you need should be in the words that are presented. In addition, in many cases, there might be words included that have no real bearing on the solution. These are red herring words that are designed to make the task slightly more difficult. But you should assume with a problem set that the instructor has chosen words that will exemplify something of linguistic relevance, and that your job is to uncover whatever it is that is relevant. Have a go at this set, which is more complex than the last ones. As before, hit pause while you look for the minimal pairs, and by the way, if you're interested, this set is also from Tagalog. Didn't find any minimal pairs, did you? That's right, and it means that it's time to take step 2, organize your data. Hit the pause button while you make an organizational chart for the data in this set. Then hit play again to see Jeff's chart. Here it is. There are only 3 environments for each sound, but when you look at them, you can see that one environment can be summed up in one nice, neat phrase, between 2 vowels. And the other one can only be described with 2 qualifiers, either at the beginning of a word or right after a nasal. This would be an elsewhere condition, and just like we said before, this is good evidence of complementary distribution and an allophonic relationship. Which sound is the underlying phoneme? The one that has the elsewhere condition, in this case, d. And there you have it. There are multitudes of phonology problem sets, out on the web, in phonology textbooks, and there's even at least one book solely dedicated to phonology problem sets. They're excellent training for identifying the kinds of patterns that sounds display when they're used in languages, and they often demonstrate how much sound relationships can vary between languages. For example, in English, aspirated and unaspirated stops are allophones of the same phoneme, but those same 2 surface-level sounds, an aspirated stop and an unaspirated stop, are completely different phonemic units to speakers of many other languages. This is all part of what it means to understand how language is structured, and as they say, the more you know. Now, there are many ways to complete this phrase. Let me give you 2 that resonate with me. The first is from the perspective of academic and scientific inquiry. I would argue that the more you know, the richer the experience of life can be. This is because I find specific value in looking beneath the surface of things to try to discover realities that underlie superficial differences. In essence, this is what defines science. It's the search for predictability and hidden similarities. And as applied to language, the scientific enterprise entails finding those things that make us increasingly certain about how people actually use language to communicate. However, it isn't all about academics and science. A purely practical way to end the sentence, "the more you know," is to say that the more you know, the better you're going to be able to do the job of being a speech-language pathologist, whose primary task is to identify difference and/or disorder, and then to be able to offer remediation when that's desired. The deeper your understanding of language is from a scientific perspective, the more tools you'll have at your disposal to help people. And that end is easily sufficient to justify the hard work of learning the mechanics of phonology. Thanks for watching, and enjoy.